Black Lagoon does not ease new viewers into its world by explaining how they should feel about it. It opens on a criminal city where violence is routine, morality is situational, and survival depends on understanding systems rather than appealing to principles. People are not sorted by good or bad so much as by whether they can function without destabilizing what already exists. Compassion is present, but it is not treated as inherently powerful, and cruelty is ordinary enough that it rarely announces itself. Within that environment appear Hänsel and Gretel, twin siblings, who operate with such closeness that they are often perceived as a single presence. Their violence is not shocking because it is excessive, but because it is composed. Killing is not framed as desperation or defense, but as something intimate and familiar, woven into how they relate to each other and to the world around them. Even without knowing where they come from, it is immediately apparent that they are not reacting to danger, but acting from a worldview in which violence provides structure and continuity. For viewers who know the series well, this arc is often remembered as one of the most unsettling, not because it escalates further than others, but because it refuses to resolve into reassurance. There is no redemptive turn, no moment where the story pauses long enough for the damage to be undone. That refusal can feel disorienting, because many stories train us to expect that childhood suffering implies a remaining possibility of rescue, and that if rescue does not occur, it must be because someone failed to act. The question that emerges is straightforward and persistent. Why does no one truly save the twins? Why do the adults around them exploit them, step aside, or ultimately remove them? Whether this absence of rescue reflects moral failure, indifference, or something more deliberate, and how the story understands timing, damage, and responsibility. What follows is not an argument that the twins deserve their fate and not a justification of the world that produces and discards them. It is an attempt to look closely at how the story constructs a situation in which saving them is no longer a meaningful option by the time the audience meets them, how different characters respond to that reality in incompatible but coherent ways, and how the viewer's desire for rescue grows out of expectations the story never intends to satisfy. Understanding why saving the twins never becomes a real option requires letting go of the idea of rescue as a single act and paying attention to how the story treats it as something conditional, something that depends on psychological and social structures being present long before anyone arrives with concern. The series does not approach salvation as a moment of courage or a breakthrough of empathy, but as a process that only works when certain foundations are still intact, and it shows without drawing attention to itself that those foundations are already gone by the time the twins appear. From their first scenes, the twins are presented as people whose sense of self no longer operates in a stable or continuous way. Their identities shift easily, their roles blur, and their coherence does not come from memory, long-term desire, or internal reflection, but from repetition. They remain oriented by reenacting the same patterns over and over. Violence and intimacy fuse together into a single rhythm that allows them to recognize themselves from one moment to the next. Killing does not disrupt their lives or push them into crisis. It is the structure that keeps their experience consistent. This matters because change, even at its most basic level, requires the ability to imagine oneself differently, to feel some tension between what is and what could be. That tension never appears with the twins. They are not shown hesitating privately or weighing alternatives. When no one is watching, when escape is possible, they escalate. When restraint would clearly reduce danger, they continue. This is not framed as a misunderstanding of consequences, but as indifference to them, because survival itself is no longer the central objective. What they protect instead is continuity, the maintenance of a world that feels intelligible to them, precisely because it is violent. Closely tied to this is the absence of inhibition, the simple capacity to stop once an action has begun. Many stories about violence hinge on this capacity remaining intact, treating it as the final point where intervention can still take hold. In this case, it is already gone. The twins do not slow down when caution would benefit them, and they do not adjust when excess creates new threats. Violence does not feel risky to them. It feels stabilizing. Restraint does not feel protective. It feels like the loss of the only structure that gives their lives meaning. Alongside this internal closure is the absence of any social structure capable of receiving them without reinforcing the same damage. Every environment they have moved through has rewarded harm, commodified abuse, and treated their capacity for violence as their defining value. By the time they arrive in Roanapur, there is no institution designed to hold someone indefinitely while preventing them from continuing to cause harm, no form of care that does not also function as control or exploitation, and no shared expectation that patience should override risk once instability becomes lethal. Because of this, the story never stages their fate as a debated moral decision. Debate would imply uncertainty, and what the narrative shows instead is accumulation, psychological fragmentation, loss of inhibition, and social reinforcement have already settled into a closed system. Saving the twins is not rejected in a dramatic refusal. It is quietly rendered obsolete by conditions that have already resolved into inevitability.
Damn it, why? Why did this have to happen? Everyone in her life betrayed her. They turned her into a monster. They turned her into a fucking monster.
The pressure to believe that the twins might still be saved intensifies once Rock becomes directly involved. Because even for viewers with little familiarity with the series, he occupies a role that feels immediately legible. He is not embedded in the criminal systems that govern the city. He does not treat violence as background noise, and he approaches the twins with attention rather than suspicion. When he listens, he does not interrupt or correct, and when he speaks, he frames what they have lived through as something that did not have to define the entire shape of existence, implying that the world might still contain meaning beyond the cycle they know. What the story makes clear, without stating it outright, is that Rock's arrival does not reopen possibilities that were waiting to be used. It marks the point at which those possibilities have already collapsed. By the time he is close enough to offer genuine care, the surrounding systems have shifted from instability into resolution. The city has already classified the twins as a destabilizing presence rather than an anomaly to be managed. The mechanisms that preserve balance have already begun to move, and the path ahead has already narrowed beyond recovery. Rock does not arrive too late because he hesitates or misunderstands, but because the conditions that would have allowed his compassion to function no longer exist. It can feel as though Rock almost succeeds, because the story allows moments where Gretel appears calmer, more open, less performative. Those moments are not dismissed or undercut. They matter on a human level. Empathy is felt, safety briefly exists, and recognition occurs. What does not happen is reorganization. The narrative is careful to separate being understood from being able to change, showing that the former can occur even when the latter is no longer available. Gretel's movement between vulnerability and provocation is not framed as calculated manipulation so much as instability, surfacing under pressure. When care is offered, it does not produce integration, it produces oscillation, because there's no remaining internal structure capable of holding closeness without dissolving into role, fantasy, or dissociation. Rock senses this fracture even if he cannot fully articulate it, and the discomfort he experiences is not the realization that he has failed, but the recognition that the tools he believes in no longer correspond to the situation in front of him. Revy's response to the twins often appears harsher by comparison, but her behavior is grounded in observation rather than indifference. She watches what happens when escape is available, when restraint would reduce risk, when mercy creates openings, and she sees that escalation follows each opportunity rather than hesitation. Where Rock focuses on what the twins have endured, Revy focuses on what they do when no one is forcing their hand, and what she observes is not fear-seeking relief, but control-seeking expression. The story does not frame these responses as competing moral positions. Rock represents the belief that recognition should matter whenever it arrives. Revy represents the acceptance that timing determines whether recognition can function at all. Their tension remains unresolved because the situation itself does not allow resolution. Compassion arrives, refusal stands firm, and neither alters the outcome, not because either response is empty, but because the damage they are responding to has already finished taking shape.
Will the darkness feel the
By the time the story reaches its end, there's no remaining tension about what might have happened differently, only the quiet recognition that the outcome has been in place for a long time, waiting for the narrative to catch up to it. The arc does not close with a sense of justice or resolution, because either would suggest that something had been corrected, and nothing here ever is. Not the damage done to the twins, not the limits of compassion, and not the systems that absorb and discard what they cannot contain. What lingers is not the violence itself, but the accumulation of small confirmations that intervention never arrives early enough to matter, that understanding can exist without transformation, and that care, when offered after identity has collapsed, functions more as acknowledgement than rescue. The twins are not denied salvation in a decisive moment of refusal. They are simply never presented with a version of the world where salvation still operates as a meaningful possibility. Rock's grief makes sense because he encounters the point where compassion reaches its limit, where seeing clearly does not grant the ability to change anything. Revy's distance makes sense because she accepts that limit earlier, before it becomes emotionally unavoidable. Rowanapur's response makes sense because it is not built to repair what arrives broken beyond function, only to prevent further collapse. Each response is internally consistent, even if none of them are comforting. The discomfort the story leaves behind is not meant to accuse the characters or the audience. It comes from realizing how much damage can occur without a single moment that feels like a clear turning point, how timing can matter more than intention, and how the desire to save someone can persist long after saving has stopped being possible. The tragedy is not that no one cared about the twins, but that by the time anyone could see them clearly, there was nothing left that saving could reasonably mean.
She calls.